This is episode 14 of the Nothing Human podcast. 3 Powers of the Human Spirit, part 14. More on internal and external standards.
I am a human being. Nothing human can be alien to me.
Welcome to the Nothing Human podcast, a biblically informed think space for exploring and articulating all the ways we make or break sense of human experience. I'm your host, Michael Minkoff. From my youngest days, I have been fascinated with categories of thought, those often unconscious filing mechanisms that invisibly populate our premises, direct our inquiries, and ordain our conclusions. Join me as we investigate and interrogate our assumptions in an effort to articulate a more cohesive understanding of human information within the superstructure of God's truth. Welcome back to the Nothing Human podcast for the 14th episode on the 3 Powers of the Human Spirit. I'm Michael Minkoff. If you haven't already listened to the other 13 episodes in this series, I recommend you do that, or you can just start here and see what you can make of it all. Thank you to everyone who supports me and my family through Patreon. I'll be posting a new article in my Questions in Genesis series on why Satan fell this month, if everything goes according to my plan, which sometimes it doesn't. And that will be available early to all my paid Patreon supporters. I just posted an update with a couple of polls for my Patreon supporters as well. One of those polls was asking for a vote on the next series I plan on doing, or that you would like to see me do. So if you're not a Patreon supporter and you want some input on my next series, or access to articles early, or the ability to chat with me on our community threads there, you can have all that and more for as little as $5 a month. And that's just $60 a year. That's like the cost of a dozen lattes a year or something. Anyway, thank you to everyone who already supports me and my family on Patreon. And you can find all my available podcasts with episode notes on my website, nothinghumanpodcast.com. Like I said, please comment on my episodes there. I really appreciate it. That's actually very helpful to me. I am a dialogic or external or exterior processor, which means I really like to figure things out by talking through them out loud in conversation with people and with God in prayer. So anyway, your comments and suggestions and questions and objections really help me to process. So I appreciate all of you who have engaged with me on my website and elsewhere. So keep doing whatever you can. And thank you all so very much. All right, let's get into it. In February of 2023, I sold a Pokemon card to someone on the internet. Specifically, I sold a Gengar VMAX alternate art secret near mint holofoil card for $145. Now, this amount may surprise you for a single card in a collectible card game. It certainly surprised me, but full disclosure, the cheapest one of those same cards I could find today was listed for almost $800, so I probably sold too soon. But at the time, I remember asking my boys, all 3 of them, who were all Pokemon enthusiasts, very much so at the time, and I asked them, was that card actually worth $145? And all of them, without any exceptions, said no. So I said, okay, so you're saying the $145 I got paid for that card isn't real? And they said, well, no, it was real. So then I said, the card really was worth $145 then, at least in a sense. And admittedly, it's a bit of a trick question, but it points out the problem of distinguishing between real and nominal value, or intrinsic or ascribed value. There are things that are valuable on their own terms. There are things that we give value to. And in the case of the Gengar VMAX, did it have a real or intrinsic value, or just an ascribed value? And again, this is a bit of a trick question. Even if you're talking about Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, or a paper dollar, the difference between real and ascribed value is blurred. Something can become really valuable simply because it is valued, and each of the 3 powers encounters this. Whether you're talking about what is really righteous or really good or really true, the difference between intrinsic and ascribed value eventually becomes really blurry. If something is legal, does that make it right? Is goodness really measured in whether enough people value something? Is truth nothing more than just a consensus opinion? You may be tempted to say no, but you'd also have to admit that if something was really righteous, you would think it would become legal and even commended by a community. If something was really good, you'd think it would likely be valued. If something were really true, you would expect it to become agreed upon by the consensus, at least eventually. That's what we mean when we say the truth will out and all that. So you might want to shortcut this whole process by just bringing God into it at the beginning. You might say, no. Something is right, good, or true if and only if God says so. End of story, full stop, problem solved. And though I would agree on one hand, I would also point out that this doesn't really solve very many of our real disputes. Because the question would still be, yes, that may be true, but how do I know what values of right or good or true God has actually put on things? And this isn't a trivial question. Let's just begin with righteousness and talk about that for a minute. God has given us a law to tell us what is right, but that law has to be interpreted and applied, and that's where the confusion always arises. Note that both abolitionists of slavery and apologists for slavery used God's law to justify their positions and thought they were well justified in their positions. None of us think we should still be sacrificing animals in the temple, even though God gave us that law too. And truth is the same way. People disagree sometimes, even fundamentally, on some very basic elements of what's actually real, even when they're arguing straight from the scriptures. This affects all sorts of real questions, like from the origin and age of the cosmos, to the literal or mythical existence of certain biblical patriarchs, to the literal or symbolic interpretation of biblical prophecy. Whatever your opinion on these things, you can't really ignore that there are real and sometimes even vehement disagreements about these things between people who at least see themselves as honest seekers of the truth. And when it comes to goodness, there is again a huge amount of disagreement on what God would find beautiful or fitting, even among those who are doing their best to form their tastes from Scripture or what they see at least as true religion. Simply put, how to access God's opinion on these matters is precisely what we're all having difficulty determining. So I'm very wary of anyone telling me that they've actually arrived conclusively and definitively at God's opinion. I think you should be wary of this too. I had a pastor when I was younger who used to say to the congregation, like from the pulpit, that's what the Bible says. So if you disagree with that, you're not disagreeing with man, you're disagreeing with God. And that has some rhetorical power and force, but even as a kid, I was like, yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man. And it was. Satan quoted scripture when he tempted Jesus. Jesus didn't feel like he had to agree with Satan simply because Satan quoted the scriptures. We should hold our own opinions with conviction, certainly. I have no question about that. But we should also hold our opinions with great humility. I'm currently convinced of what I'm saying, as I'm sure you're currently convinced of whatever you're thinking. But we are both most definitely wrong about a lot. And we don't even know what we're wrong about. That's the problem. So let's all take Treebeard's advice here, and let's not be too hasty. But that said, you can't really exist in a state of uncertainty on what you hold to be true, good, or righteous. As much as we might not like to decide, we don't really have a choice. We must live, and we have to make choices on what we think and what we feel so far. And we also want to feel like we're in harmony with our current standards. We want our standards, wherever they are in their development, to approve of us, to say, yes, you are righteous, you are good, you are true. So how do you determine if you have the approval of your standards? If you pursue goodness first, how do you rate your progress toward that goal? How do you know if the good you have gotten thus far is actually good? If righteousness or justice is your goal, how do you know if you are actually becoming more righteous or more right over time? If being correct or authentic or true is your goal, how do you actually determine authenticity or integrity? And this is where the internal and external standards come in. A number of you have mentioned that you're a little bit confused about how these work, and so I'm going to try and dig in a little bit deeper into this. And we might call internal and external standards outside in or inside out dispositions of the powers. So they're kind of the aspect of your powers, the direction that your powers are pointed, whether they determine harmony from the inside out or harmony from outside in to reach an agreement between ourselves and our communities. Ultimately, we all want this agreement. We want to be in agreement or accord with our community and with ourselves. But how we pursue achieving that agreement from inside out or outside in has a huge impact, obviously, on our personality. So one way of looking at this outside in or inside out disposition is expressed in a quote from George Bernard Shaw, where he says, quote, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." So I think that's a little tongue-in-cheek maybe, but let's look at these dispositions in greater detail, this outside in or inside out dispositions. So in all three powers, there is a receiving and a giving. There is a passive and an active quality to the power. The power of the intellect then both receives and produces truth. The power of the will both receives and produces righteousness. And the power of the affections both receives and produces goodness. What we experience when our powers confirm our status as adequate to a standard can be measured in terms of this receiving or giving. So, for instance, if we receive the status of righteous from outside in, we would say we are justified. If we produce the status of righteousness from inside out, we are just. If we receive the status of good from outside in, we would say we are valued. If we produce the status of good from inside out, we would say we're valuable. If we receive the status of true from outside in, we are authenticated. If we produce the status of true from inside out, we are authentic. So you can see there's that passive and that active. And this is not just applied to ourselves. Sometimes we ascribe these statuses, in fact, all the time, we ascribe these same statuses to anything outside of ourselves, like to actions, choices, people, objects, information, etc. In terms of goodness, for instance, the goal of the affections, things can be valuable almost intrinsically because of utility or beauty or preciousness. So let's look at something that's actually valuable in some sort of an intrinsic way. Let's say gold, for instance, has all three of these values. It's useful, it is beautiful, and it is rare. So we tend to say, on its own terms, gold is valuable. And because it's valuable, humans have valued it. So because it is valuable, it has been valued. Because it has intrinsic value, we have ascribed value to it. But you look at Bitcoin, on the other hand, and you say, well, it has little intrinsic value other than as a private, convenient, and decentralized means of exchange and maybe an elegant piece of code. And it is artificially limited, which gives it at least the effect of preciousness or rarity. But it is mostly valuable, mostly in as much as it is valued. And if it were to cease to be valued, if we were to stop ascribing value to Bitcoin, it would probably also cease to be valuable. This applies to righteousness and truth as well. We think an opinion is authenticated by its agreement with a consensus of experts in a field, or we are convinced an opinion is authentic even if not yet authenticated by others because it somehow resonates with our own thinking or intellect. It seems to have some intrinsic or internal truth. Some would argue something is right, also, if it agrees with the laws agreed upon in a community. Others would say might makes right, and that even the lawgiver in a community is just someone with enough power to establish their own will as justice. So, because of this fact that internal value, real value, can create external value, ascribed value, and vice versa, meaning sometimes ascribed value creates real value. So we don't always distinguish between them. Sometimes it's hard, actually, to distinguish between them. Notice that similar to intrinsic or ascribed value, like with the Gengar VMAX card, a received value can become a produced value and vice versa. So the Gengar VMAX, because it had an ascribed value of $145, actually produced $145 worth of goodness value for me. That was a real value then, even if that real value only occurred because someone was willing to say it was worth that to them and then pay that money. So in the case of the Gengar VMAX card, it became valuable because it was valued. But you can see this could work in the opposite direction too. Things can become valued because they prove valuable, and things are generally more valued depending on how difficult they are to acquire, even if they remain the same degree of valuable. So we see this all the time with currencies. An American dollar is not more or less intrinsically valuable, but only more or less valued. Yet I hope you can see the amount that a dollar is valued changes the amount to which it can produce real value. On the other hand, you have something like whale oil, which actually altered in terms of being able to produce value. So there was a time when the whale oil industry was huge and whale oil had a really high price on it because people really found a lot of utility in whale oil. But in about 1859, when they discovered petroleum, the actual value of whale oil started to decrease, and its valuation, how much people valued it, then began to decline in keeping with its real loss of value. So you can see these go both directions all the time. So ascribed or real value often becomes blurred at some point in this process of equilibrium. And we don't always make enough of a distinction between internal and external values. And this is a problem. It creates a lot of problems and some degree of confusion. I'll give you another example. You might think a particular classic movie is edifying and beautifully made and unique. That this particular movie, has internal, intrinsic, or almost objective value as a movie. You may have felt this even when you first began watching the movie, for any number of reasons. And this first sense of value prompted you then to invest hours of time rewatching the movie, investigating its production, continually marveling over its quality and its favorable relationship to the larger world of cinema. Like, if this movie didn't exist, how many other movies wouldn't exist because this movie was so influential or so important? And you might feel like all of your later investments, the ascription of value, have only reinforced your opinion that the movie really was valuable in a real intrinsic sense in the first place, so that it was worth at least as much as you thought it was. But maybe someone else doesn't feel the same way about that movie. That movie, to their feeling, is quote-unquote overrated by you. Not necessarily because they disagree with you on internal terms. They may not have even invested enough to know or feel what you do about the movie. In some ways, the movie just isn't valuable to them because they simply never set value on it. So can we say for certain from our perspective that the movie is only valued and not valuable, or that it is valuable but not properly valued, or that ascribed value is not real? Because they didn't value the movie, perhaps they haven't found it valuable. Because you found it valuable, you have learned to set value on it. We don't often consider how our set of values develop, where they come from, how we negotiate them. And when something has value to us, we might be tempted to think it's because that thing is objectively valuable, and this is not always the case. So, nonetheless, all that said, we can detect in each power this process of giving and receiving value. We can detect a passive and active quality to each power. We all give and receive in each power, but some of us have a disposition to receive in order to give, and others have a disposition to give in order to receive. And the direction of this is not at all trivial, because each of us has a primary aspect or primary disposition, either internal or external. This is actually what I mean when I'm talking about internal or external standards. So we called receiving a righteousness the state of being justified. This is a passive state. And if it's very important to you, I would say that's because you have an external standard. You want a standard of righteousness from outside of you to confirm that you are in fact justified. It requires then that someone or a group of someones from outside of you declare you to be righteous. This is outside in, this is external standard. So this group or this community that you trust, they confer their own righteousness onto you. Actually, that's what's happening by including you in their identity of righteousness, in other words. So, for instance, a judge might declare you not guilty. If you're accused of a crime, you can't really declare yourself not guilty. So his authority and his righteousness then authorizes him to confer on you a state of righteousness. And if you afterwards prove to be a criminal again, that might even affect the judge's reputation. But it will also mean you lose your status of quote-unquote justified inside that community. Then this desire not to lose your status of belonging might produce a pressure in you that makes you a more just person. So because you've been justified and included in this community of righteousness, that might produce a pressure in you that makes you more just. So you're justified first, and that maybe produces justice in you. Regardless of whether or not that actually happens, by declaring you not guilty, the judge has welcomed you, at least for a time, into a shared righteousness with him and the community that trusts him, and that gave him authority. So we don't think about this very often in these terms, but I think it's important because that's what's really going on when we are, quote, justified. And being unjustified means we are rejected from the community righteousness or declared guilty by the court of public opinion. So we become outcast or exiled from the community identity, sometimes even literally pushed out, exiled, canceled. So being just, in contrast to being justified, involves an active doing. So justified is passive, but being just is active. Just people produce and give righteous deeds. But you can see, I hope quite clearly, that a person who does righteous things, who produces real righteousness, is almost certainly going to be declared righteous in the moment anyone was willing to receive those acts as righteous. So, for instance, the judge is implicitly declared just. In other words, he is justified whenever anyone accepts his decisions as validly justifying of others. In other words, doesn't the community agree that the judge is righteous, and in that way confer a status of justified even on the judge? Yeah, that's true. And wouldn't most justified people also be just people? Yeah, because we don't often declare unjust people just, at least usually, and we probably shouldn't. But that doesn't mean we can't learn anything from the distinction. It certainly does go both ways, and the difference between the real and ascribed realities we're talking about does become blurred. You can be justified because you are just. You can also be just because you are justified. The judge becomes justified because he is just. The defendant becomes just because he is justified. But this direction, inside out or outside in, is at the heart of internal-external standards. So if the aspect or direction of your powers values outside in against inside out, I would call that an external standard. If you feel just because you have been justified by some community's stamp of approval, you have an external standard. If you feel justified because you pursue the right thing and you persist in attempting to conform your environment to yourself, that is an internal standard. And like George Bernard Shaw said, progress and leadership depends on those relatively rare people who operate with internal standards, inside out rather than outside in. You can see this in the realm of truth as well. It has been discussed at length in a lot of various different books and essays. One in particular, Thomas Kuhn's book, Structures of Scientific Revolution, describes the process through which a scientific consensus or paradigm is challenged and overturned. Almost always this occurs because of relatively very few scientists who dare, in their unreasonable disagreeability, to challenge the reinforced, ascribed, and external status quo. This is so regularly the case that some, including Michael Crichton in an article that he wrote, argued that consensus science doesn't even exist. It's an oxymoron. That the only science that ever is real science is usually done by some rogue maverick dude who everybody disagrees with until they realize he's right. And I think that goes too far. Certainly, advancements and progress depends on those few internal standard truth seekers who brave the wilderness of professional exile in order to pursue their own real discoveries. But those people would have nothing to interact with or modify or even challenge if many generations of scientists had not wrestled with, refined, and submitted to the consensus opinion. So both are necessary. The glory of a king is his people. The glory of a people is their king. It goes both directions. I'll give you another example to kind of clarify this a little bit more. In American, Henry Ford is credited as being the visionary who first invented the assembly line, and it's a brilliant innovation. But American car manufacturing has been vastly outstripped by Japanese refinement and automation of a process that the Japanese adopted and perfected. They didn't create it, but they've adopted it and refined it. The Japanese, being external standard in their disposition, have very little success internationally in new research and development. They're not well known for R&D, but they have become famous for refining and bettering the inventions of others, and this goes back to ancient times. In fact, in Japanese history, they adopted, for instance, Chinese characters, Chinese dress from the Song Dynasty, the kimono, and the tea time, and all of that kind of stuff. And when you think, what did China look like in the Song Dynasty? You can't even find it in China anymore, but it has been preserved in Japan. Rice paper houses, tea time kimonos, etc. What we typically think of as traditional Japanese culture, they borrowed that from the Chinese in the Song Dynasty and refined it. In fact, what's really interesting is that the Japanese kanji, which is actually just the Hanzi from the Mandarin. So this is Chinese characters. The Japanese kanji are Chinese characters, and the Japanese still use the traditional characters even after the Chinese simplified them after the communist regime took power in 1949. So the Japanese are great at preserving, refining, and developing things, even if they didn't come up with them themselves. So I hope we can agree that both processes are important, essential, and valuable. So this whole discussion of internal and external standards rests on a very old philosophical debate. And you might have even noted this debate, if you're familiar with it, up to this point. You might have said, this reminds me of the nominalism and realism debate. And you're right, that is very much connected to this. Nominalism emphasizes ascribed value, and realism, as the name would indicate, emphasizes real value. So nominalism kind of says, things are the way they are because we say they are the way they are, but they don't actually have that intrinsic reality. We grant that or ascribe that to reality, and by naming something, we kind of make it what it is. And then the realist would say, no, things are what they are, whatever you name them, and our whole process should be naming them what they actually are. Now, I think both nominalism and realism have a value, and neither are exclusively true, as I hope you've probably figured out in this episode. When God names something, it really is what he names it. So, having declared us as justified, we are just. If we are not just, we can be sure he has not justified us. So, which of those is true? Is that nominal or real? Well, it's both. That whatever God names, nominalism, is also realism. So, let me talk a little bit more about how God does this and how we see this in the scriptures. The interchange between internal and external standards produces the harmony, or at least equilibrium, of the individual and his or her community. So this means that the peace of a community depends on the stability of this agreement between individual and collective concerns, or individual and collective values. In other words, it depends on the stability of a covenantal relationship. We don't necessarily think about it like that, but the agreement or equilibrium between internal and external standards, between authority and submission, between the leader and the follower, this is the nature of a covenant. Now, we don't often think of the Ten Commandments, God's law code, as a covenant, but it's actually called a covenant throughout the Old Testament. I'll give you a representative example. In Exodus 34, verses 27 and 28, it reads, Then Yahweh said to Moses, Write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. So he was there with Yahweh 40 days and 40 nights. He did not eat bread or drink water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. So right there, it says explicitly the 10 Commandments are the words of a covenant. Now, if a covenant is an agreement between two parties, usually the leader and the follower, and it usually contains obligations for both parties, Are there any obligations in the Ten Commandments that are connected to God? Because we usually look at the Ten Commandments and we think it's a law code, and it is specifically having to do with just our obligations. But what's really interesting, and when I first realized this, it was a real aha moment. Hebrew actually has an explicitly imperative mood, meaning it can deliver imperatives, commands. But the only commandment in the whole Ten Commandments that actually contains an imperative is the fifth commandment, honor your father and your mother. Other than that, all of the commands in the Ten Commandments are in the imperfect tense. That's why they're translated the way they are. So, for instance, when you read the first commandment, it doesn't say, don't have any other gods before me. Though that's what it may mean for us, it actually says, you will not have any other gods before me. That has an imperative force, but it also has another meaning. It's not merely a command, it's a promise. With it, God is promising not only to declare the people righteous so that they are justified and welcomed into the community of His righteousness and enjoying the benefits of His good name, but also that they will have real righteousness. He is promising that by being justified, they will become just, because whatever God says is so. Believe that, and may it be true for you all. All right, one last thing. I wanted to take this time to highlight a couple of questions actually, that I received on my website for episode 3, where I first discussed internal and external standards. This is from Lisa Hood, which if you've spent any time on my website, you know she is like the engagement superhero. So she sometimes apologizes to me for asking so many questions and making so many comments, but honestly, I really appreciate it, and Lisa, don't stop. As you'll see, her comments are really insightful, and they produce a lot of further thought. But don't let her question-asking prowess intimidate you, because at michaelminkoff.com, we don't believe in stupid questions, so fire away. But anyway, here's her question on internal and external standards. So, quote, first, I want to clarify external versus internal standard for the Christian. I know there are those who truly have only internal standards, who really believe their own feelings, thoughts, or inclinations are authoritative, but I don't think that this is a position a Christian can consistently hold. As you mentioned in an earlier episode, God is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the definition of truth, goodness, and righteousness, the perfect external standard, which might tempt one to think that those with an internal standard are less Christian somehow, but I think your discussion on universal standards is intended to address that. We are all incapable of perfectly knowing or understanding God's standards, since His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And so the way two Christians might be distinguished is not by whether they bow to God's standard, but in how they seek to know that standard. Those with internal standards might try to learn the standard of God by the prompting of the Holy Spirit, by their study of the Word of God, by reading 18 books on a subject and picking bits and pieces from several to make a whole, by prayer and meditation. And those with external standards might try to learn the standards of God by the teaching of a pastor or pope, by reading a favorite author or listening to a favorite podcast, by how their parents taught them, by tradition. Does this align with your understanding? So that was her first question. Her second question is, I have a question about internal and external standards and how they relate to introversion and extroversion. So there are multiple definitions of an introvert and an extrovert, but at least some of them overlap with the way you described approaches to standards in a way I'd like to explore. Do you think introversion and extroversion align with how people have standards? If so, do you think it is a complete overlap or just a correlation? You mentioned how one with external standards doesn't like being out of alignment with the community, but I think it is possible to really want to fit in and really value relationships and tribe, but also to prioritize one's individual conscience standard over the community standards. Such a person whose conscience makes them persist in being contrary to their tribe, but who is unsettled by that, rather than enjoying being the rebel, would be, based on my understanding of these categories, both an internal standards person and an extrovert. Would you agree? So those are both really great questions. I really appreciate them, Lisa. and it gives me an opportunity to talk about a few more things on the internal and external standard on this podcast episode. So here's how I replied. Lisa, first, this is really good. Thank you so much for taking so much time to think through these things. I had a similar misgiving about the possibility of misunderstanding the internal-external standard. I thought there might be people who basically assumed that having an internal standard would be wrong, especially if we're supposed to submit ourselves to rightful authority and to God. And on the other hand, there could also be people who believe defaulting to an external standard is wrong, since we are to obey God rather than human beings. How you have described my understanding on this is right on. I agree with your clarification and wish I had explained it more like you just did. Ha ha, I said. For a Christian, the internal or external standard distinction is about a proclivity or default inclination in the person to formulate their standard source and also to assess their alignment with that standard feedback. Ultimately, everyone must be convinced in their own mind, but some default to internal means for their standard source and feedback on alignment, and others default to an external means, depending on what the community standard might be, which could be better or worse depending on the community, and the internal resources a person has, which again could be better or worse depending on the individual. Defaulting to one or the other has its advantages and its pitfalls. I really appreciate your clarification on this. On the second question, I also considered how the internal-external standard could relate to introversion-extroversion. I considered talking about it in the episode, but as you're about to see, I'm not entirely clear on how they relate. I'm glad you thought about it too, and I'm happy to bumble my way through some thoughts on it. As you said, there are a lot of definitions of introvert-extrovert. The one I think makes most sense and actually produces meaningful distinctions is that the introvert has a lower threshold for risk when it comes to interactions with the unknown, either personal or circumstantial, and extrovert has a higher threshold for these risks, meaning that the extrovert does not pay the same opportunity cost, emotionally or psychologically, that an introvert feels in the company of untested or unknown people or circumstances. I say this because most introverts have little difficulty being sociable and comfortable in circumstances or with people they know and trust, though that trust might be more easily broken since there is a vigilance, sometimes a hypervigilance, in most introverts that continually monitors these things. I hope that makes sense. I like this description of the distinction better than the common introvert equals likes being alone, extrovert equals likes being with people, because in my experience, most introverts are also human beings. They too are social beings. They just want greater control over the risks they are taking concerning the unknown. How this relates to internal and external standards is not all that clear. It's not even clear whether either of these polarities is immutable. Can a person learn how to be one or the other over time? Probably. An internal standard person is more likely to be out of accord with his community standards. So in order to be able to cope with this, he will either have to be a powerful extrovert, meaning he does not fear the unknown in social interactions and is easily able to throw off the burden of social pressures and deal with social conflict and even convince or persuade people. Or, as an introvert, he will have to retreat most carefully to the solace of a carefully selected tribe. In other words, an internal standard person could either be a Socrates or an Emily Dickinson. Socrates could clearly cope with and had no aversion to being at odds with the larger community and spending huge amounts of time talking to basic strangers, even at risk of death and rejection. Dickinson, by contrast, spent most of her adult life in seclusion at her father's house. She either didn't want or need social interaction or greatly feared it. Either way, she didn't seek or want it. On the other hand, a person with an external standard wants community approval and will, because of this, probably have a generally larger trusted social network. But they will still want to trust and to know that network. And so the size of that network kind of depends on what they can handle. In other words, they will still want to find a tribe, and that tribe might be small or large depending on their starting conditions. So if you grew up in a cult, for instance, you might be external standard, but you would learn to fear the incursion of the larger community standard and might not have the same emotional capital to bear the risks of the unknown. Further, some extroverts pursue community in order to find confirmation in that community, which would be like the external standard. Others seek a larger community in order to exercise influence or utilize opportunities in that community, sometimes even at the expense of that community. In other words, introverts and extroverts probably develop depending on other factors than internal or external standards. Again, much of this question depends on how they relate to their particular community and whether their particular powers put them at risk in that community or make them generally an asset. This could change depending on the community they are in, and most of this boils down to a feeling of vulnerability. That feeling or lack of that feeling could be from ignorance of the larger community or even yourself, meaning you may not know you're very sensitive and very vulnerable if no one ever hurts you, but as soon as you are hurt or wounded, you will know more about yourself and the outside world. Other times, this ignorance of stranger danger comes from the fact that no one can or will wound you because you happen to be the most powerful in some asset or spiritual power that everyone around you actually fears or desires. Again, if you are privileged in this way, you will not have the same social pressures or opportunity cost, even if you are out of accord with community standards. So anyway, you can see, I hope, that the issue is a bit complex and ambiguous, which is why I chose not to dig into it in that episode. I do want to keep these around 40 minutes after all. Thanks for commenting, Lisa. I really appreciate it. These are great thoughts. So I hope all of this has clarified and deepened our understanding of internal and external standards a little bit more. If you have any questions or objections or comments or whatever, please do comment on the relevant episode on my website. I do try to give thorough replies to all comments, and I appreciate your engagement very much. In my Patreon January update, I said that episode 14 would be the last in the Three Powers series proper, but I actually do have one more on the Three Powers and trauma. I'll be incorporating, as well as challenging and adapting, some of the insights from the book Redeeming Heartache, How Past Suffering Reveals Our True Calling by Dan Allender and Kathy Lorzell. So tune in for that next week, and you can find all the other episodes for this podcast and my bonus podcast, Being Something Extra, on my website, nothinghumanpodcast.com. Be sure to comment on these episodes with your questions and insights, and also remember to rate and review this podcast on Apple and Spotify so other people can find out about it. Thank you all, and until next time.
I am a human being. Nothing human can be alien to me.